There is a silence that exists only in very cold places. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that presses in on you, swallowing sound before it can travel. In the northern Ural Mountains, in the winter of 1959, that silence was absolute, and into it walked 9 young people who had every reason to believe they would walk back out again. They were trained, they were experienced, they were prepared. They did not vanish. They died, slowly, violently, and inexplicably, on the slope of a mountain whose name translates loosely as Dead Mountain. This is not a story about monsters or madness. It is a story about people, decisions, and an environment that does not forgive hesitation. Welcome back to the Eclectic, where we explore the moments where history fractures, where evidence exists without certainty, and where human stories are often overshadowed by the mystery built around them. Tonight's episode is one of the most analysed wilderness tragedies of the 20th century. But before we talk about theories, conclusions, or controversy, we need to do something more important. We need to meet the people who went up that mountain. Because the Dyatlov Pass Incident does not begin with a torn tent. It begins with 9 lives. To understand what happened, we need to understand where and when this story begins. It is January 1959. The Soviet Union is locked in the Cold War. Secrecy is routine, information is controlled. Mistakes are buried, not examined. But this is not a story about spies or nuclear weapons. Not yet. This is about youth. The late 1950s in the USSR were a strange, hopeful time. Stalin was dead, Khrushchev's thaw had begun, and universities encouraged endurance sports as proof of ideological strength. Hiking wasn't leisure, it was character building, a demonstration of discipline, resilience, and to complete a high-grade winter expedition was a badge of honor, one that could shape careers. 10 hikers set out from Sverdlovsk in the Soviet Union. They were students and graduates of the Ural Polytechnic Institute, embarking on a ski touring expedition to Mount Ortiton, deep in the northern Urals. The route was classified as Category 3, the highest level of difficulty recognized by Soviet hiking authorities. This classification mattered. It meant the group had had prior winter expedition experience, navigation and survival training, and proven physical endurance. This was not a reckless exploration. It was serious, sanctioned, elite trekking. Igor Alexeyevich Dyatlov was 23 years old, tall, focused, methodical. He studied radio engineering at the Ural Polytechnic Institute and was already known for designing his own equipment. Radios, stoves, makeshift technologies adapted for extreme conditions. He wasn't reckless, he was precise. Friends described him as calm under pressure, quietly authoritative, and deeply capable. When Dyatlov planned a route, people trusted it. And this expedition was his design. The goal, a winter trek across the northern Urals to reach Mount Ortiton. A Category 3 expedition, the highest level of difficulty. If successful, every member would receive official certification. They were not thrill seekers. They were professionals. There were originally 10 hikers. 9 would die. They were all young, mostly students or recent graduates, all experienced. They had skied hundreds of kilometers together before. They knew how to build snow shelters, manage hypothermia, read terrain, and ration supplies. Each member brought something different and necessary to the expedition. Zinaida Kolmogorova, 22, female, a radio engineering student known as strong, determined, and physically tough. Zina had already completed multiple long-distance winter treks. Her diary entries are grounded and pragmatic, but warm. She was often the emotional stabilizer, pushing morale forward when fatigue set in. Rustem Slobodin, 23, a male engineering graduate and accomplished athlete, described as competitive, resilient, and driven. Rustem pushed himself, sometimes to the edge of exhaustion, but he was dependable. Yuri Dovoshenko, 21, a radio engineering student, physically powerful and fearless. On a previous expedition, Yuri had chased a bear away from the camp with a hammer. He was not easily frightened. Yuri Krivonashenko, 23, a construction worker and former UPI student, described as cheerful, musical, and popular. He played the mandolin, told jokes, and kept spirits high. In difficult conditions, people like Yuri matter more than they realize. Ludmila Dubinina, 20, an economic student and experienced hiker, serious, disciplined, and highly organized. Ludia believed deeply in preparation and responsibility. She was known to challenge decisions she felt were unsafe, respectfully but firmly. Semyon Solotarov, 38, the oldest member of the group, a decorated World War II veteran and hiking instructor. He joined shortly before departure. He was older, quieter, and more reserved. He stood slightly apart, not unwelcome, just different. Alexander Kolyvotov, 24, thoughtful and technically trained. Sources vary, but place his background in radio technology or nuclear-related studies. He was calm, introspective, and steady. Nikolai Thibiu-Brignol, 23. A civil engineering student, sociable and well-liked, he brought humour and ease, the glue that keeps the group together. And then there was Yuri Yudin, 21. On the 23rd of January 1959, the group boarded a train heading north to Sverdlovsk. It carried skis, rucksacks, and optimism. Along the way, they sent postcards, wrote diary entries, and documented the journey carefully. Nothing in their writing suggested fear or foreboding or doubt. On the 27th of January, they reached the last inhabited settlement, a logging town called Vizhe. This was on the edge of the map. From here on, there would be no roads, no villages, and no help. On the 28th of January, one of the group turned back. Yuri Yudin fell ill early in the journey. He had joint pain, weakness, and fatigue. He made the decision to turn back. It was sensible, but it was disappointing. But it saved his life. He hugged the others goodbye and returned home. Yudin would spend the rest of his life knowing that a simple illness, nothing dramatic, nothing heroic, separated him from the others. He later said that if he had continued, he would have died with them. The group continued north, deeper into the wilderness. They skied through forests where the snow reached their thighs. They crossed frozen rivers. They camped in temperatures below minus 20 degrees Celsius. Their diaries remained light-hearted. They mocked the weather, teased each other, complained about frozen boots and poor visibility. On the 31st of January, they reached the edge of the forest. This was their last natural shelter. Ahead lay open slopes, exposed, wind-scored, brutally cold. They cached excess supplies in the trees, planning to retrieve them on the return journey. This was smart, experienced, and deliberate. That night they camped near the forest line. The next day they would ascend. What happened next is important, not because it explains the mystery, but because it shows how normal everything still was. On the 1st of February 1959, the remaining 9 hikers reached the eastern slope of Goholatsikal. The weather was deteriorating, visibility dropped, and wind increased. They faced a decision. Rather than descending into the forest to camp, which would mean losing altitude and progress, they chose to pitch their tent on the exposed slope. This choice has been debated endlessly, but it wasn't irrational. Experienced hikers sometimes camp high to maintain route integrity, avoid losing distance, and to train for harsh conditions. They cut into the snow, built a platform, pitched their large canvas tent. Inside, they ate dinner, shared food, and removed boots. Their skis were placed outside, their coats hung near the entrance. Their diaries end here. Photographs taken that evening show cooperation, laughter, and calm routine. No sign of fear. No sense of danger. They cooked, ate, and settled in for the night. And then the mountain began to change. Kohal Sikal is not dramatic. It is not steep. It does not roar. Its danger lies in exposure. Wind scours snow across the slopes, building pressure violently. Temperatures that night are estimated at -25 to -30 degrees Celsius. At those temperatures, exposed skin freezes within minutes, dexterity fails rapidly, and judgment degrades. The margin for error is thin, and once crossed, it cannot be recrossed. Sometime after midnight, something happened. Something powerful enough to drive 9 people from their shelter. Something terrifying enough to make them flee half-dressed into temperatures that could kill within minutes. Something so sudden that they didn't retrieve boots, coats, or weapons. Something so confusing that they didn't return. It wasn't a roar, it wasn't a scream, but a force enough to make trained hikers believe that staying put meant death. They cut their way out of the tent from the inside. They left boots, coats, equipment, not because they were careless, because they believed they had no time. Their footprints show order, not panic. 9 people moved together downhill toward the forest. This detail matters. People in blind terror scatter. These hikers did not, which makes what happened next all the more disturbing. At this point in the story, nothing supernatural has occurred. 9 people went to sleep on a mountainside. They were warm enough, they were fed, they were together. By morning, all 9 would be dead. Not from exposure alone, not from injury alone, not from a single simple cause. After the group separated, after the cold began to win, because the Dyatlov Pass Incident is not one event, it is a sequence, and the sequence is where the truth lives. In the next section, we descend into the night itself, the torn tent, the footprints, the bodies beneath the trees, and the first question investigators would ask, a question still unanswered more than 60 years later. Why did they leave the tent? There is no sound more unsettling than silence after disaster. No cries, no alarms, no warning carried down the mountain. When the night closed over the mountain on the 1st of February 1959, whatever happened to the Dyatlov group happened without witnesses and without survivors. What we know comes not from testimony, but from what they left behind. And what they left behind makes no sense. The group was due to send a telegram by the 12th of February. When it didn't arrive, no one panicked. Winter expeditions were unpredictable, delays were expected. But by the 20th, families began pressing the authorities. A search was organised, reluctantly at first, then with urgency. Students, volunteers, local Mansi hunters, eventually military personnel. On the 26th of February, searchers found something on the eastern slope of the mountain, a dark shape against the snow. A tent. The tent was still standing, partially collapsed, half buried by drifting snow. At first glance it looked abandoned, not destroyed. But when searchers approached, they froze. The tent had been cut open from the inside. Long slashes ran through the canvas, deliberate, forceful. It wasn't torn by the wind nor clawed by animals, but the tent was cut. Inside, everything was still there. Boots, coats, hats, gloves, money, passports, food, even a camera. Leading away from the tent were footprints. Bare feet, socks, one boot, felt shoes. They moved downhill, not running, but walking. The tracks leading away from the tent told the investigators something crucial. They did not run, they walked. 9 sets of footprints, some in socks, some in a single shoe, some barefoot, moved downhill in roughly the same direction. toward the tree line about 1.5 miles away. There was no sign of pursuit, no other footprints, and no indication of chaos. This was not blind panic. This was retreat. Whatever had happened at the tent convinced them that remaining on the slope was more dangerous than facing the cold, and so they made the only decision that still offered options. They went to the forest. To anyone unfamiliar with winter trekking, the decision to leave shelter and head into the dark seems irrational, but to experienced hikers, the forest offered 3 things that the open slope could not: reduced wind, access to firewood, and visual orientation. Trees reduce the wind. They provide material for fire, and they anchor you psychologically, giving shape to the dark. From the hiker's perspective, the forest was not safety, but it was less danger. At the edge of the forest stood a tall cedar. It became the focal point of the group's next decision. Beneath it, searchers later found the remains of a small campfire. The fire was not large, it was not well established, but it existed, and that alone tells us something important. Despite shock, cold, and possible injury, the group was still thinking, still organising, and still trying to survive. Near the cedar tree lay the bodies of Yuri Dovoshenko and Yuri Krivoshenko. They were dressed only in underwear and light clothing. Both showed signs of severe hypothermia. Their hands were damaged. Their skin burned in places, not from flame, but from prolonged exposure to heat as sensation failed. Krivoshenko had bitten his own knuckle. This is not madness. It is a recognized response to extreme cold, stress, and fading consciousness. Branches high up the cedar were broken up to 5 meters high, suggesting that one of the hikers had climbed up to look for something. Perhaps the camp, possibly to assess conditions, maybe signal others. Doroshenko and Krivoshenko likely remained by the fire, whether by choice, injury, or exhaustion. They did not die instantly. They died slowly. At some point, the group separated. This was not abandonment, it was triage. Survival groups often make brutal calculations, not because they want to, but because they must. 3 members, Igor Dyatlov, Zenaida Kolmogorova, and Rustem Slobodin, turned back toward the tent. This decision is vital to understanding the group. They did not accept loss. They believed recovery was possible. The logic is clear. If they could retrieve boots, coats, tools, they could return to the forest and survive the night. It was a gamble, and it failed. Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin moved upslope into worsening conditions. Wind, drifting snow, darkness. They were already cold and stressed. They may already have been injured. Their bodies were later found spaced along the slope, not clustered, not together. Each fell where strength finally gave out. Zenaida Kolmogorova, she made it the furthest. Her body position suggests forward movement, collapsing during exertion. She was still trying. Igor Dyatlov, found face up, orientated toward the tent, leader until the end. Rustem Slobodin, found face down, head towards the tent. He had sustained a skull fracture. It was serious, but not immediately fatal. It was likely caused by a fall on ice or rock, worsened by fatigue and darkness. The official cause of death for all 3 was hypothermia. The environment finished what exhaustion began. 4 hikers did not attempt to return uphill. Lyudmila Dubyana, Semyon Zolotarov, Nikolai Thibyubrignol, and Alexander Kolvetov. They moved further into the forest toward a ravine. Here, they made the most technically sound decision of the night. They attempted to build a snow shelter. A den, a wind-protected space. This was advanced survival behavior, and it nearly worked. The bodies of the ravine group were not found until May. They lay beneath several meters of snow near a stream. Their injuries shocked investigators. They had crushed chests, shattered ribs, severe skull fractures, yet little external bruising. No defensive wounds, no knife marks, No signs of a fight. Ludmila Dubiana's injuries became the most sensationalized. She was missing her tongue, her eyes, and parts of her lips and face. But context matters. Her body lay in running water for months. Post-mortem tissue loss in such conditions is not unusual. Scavengers target soft tissue first: eyes, lips, tongue. The forensic examiner concluded these injuries occurred after death, not during an attack. Some members of the ravine group wore clothing that did not belong to them. This too matters. It shows awareness, cooperation, and the redistribution of resources. Clothing was taken from those already dead. This was not theft, it is survival. The forest scene shows no sign of external attackers, wild animals, or struggle between group members. It shows fire, shelter attempts, purposeful movement, and rational decision-making under collapse. These were not people fleeing madness. These were people trying, and failing, to stay alive. By dawn on the 2nd of February 1959, all 9 hikers were dead, not because they panicked, not because they were reckless, but because cold does not negotiate. We examine what came next: the investigation, the theories, the radioactive clothing, the military rumours, the avalanche debate. And finally, the question that remains: did anyone actually die mysteriously, or have we simply refused to accept how lethal nature can be? When the search teams reached the eastern slope of the mountain in late February 1959, they were not prepared for what they would find. The tent stood where the hikers had pitched it, still upright in places, partially collapsed, its fabric slashed open from the inside. Inside were boots, coats, food, and equipment, everything the group would have needed to survive the night. And yet no one was there. The mountain had kept them. The Soviet investigation began formally in February 1959. It was not careless, it was not rushed, but it was constrained by environment, by politics, and by expectation. Investigators documented the tent cuts, the footprints, the bodies and injuries, the absence of other tracks, and the lack of signs of struggle. Autopsies were performed, causes of death were assigned. 6 died of hypothermia, 3 died from fatal internal injuries. Crucially, the medical examiner noted, the injuries resemble those caused by a strong impact, comparable to a car accident, without damage to soft tissue. There was no evidence of a fight, weapons, animal attack, or a third-party involvement. And yet, there was no clear explanation either. The investigation concluded with a phrase that would haunt the case forever. The hikers died due to a compelling natural force. No further detail, no mechanism, no elaboration. The case was closed. The files were archived. The area was quietly restricted, and suspicion bloomed, not because the investigators lied, but because they didn't explain. Almost immediately, suspicion fell on the local Mansi people. They were indigenous reindeer herders, skilled hunters familiar with the terrain. But the evidence didn't support it. No foreign footprints, no weapons, no motive. The Mansi themselves joined the search. They were cleared quickly, and the name Koholatskal, Mountain of the Dead, was a coincidence, not a curse. Some of the items of clothing showed low-level radioactive contamination. This fact alone fueled decades of speculation, but context matters here. One hiker had previously worked at a facility associated with radioactive materials. The radiation was uneven, limited, and it wasn't present in all of the clothing, and it wasn't consistent with an explosion or a weapon. There were no burns, no radiation sickness, and no environmental contamination. Radiation existed, but it did not cause the death. It became a symbol because it was misunderstood. Witnesses later reported seeing glowing lights in the sky during that period. Military tests were conducted in the region. These facts are true, but correlation is not causation. There were no blast injuries, no shrapnel, and no burn patterns, and no ground disturbance. A weapons test capable of causing those injuries would have left unmistakable evidence. Instead, the scene showed slow collapse, not sudden destruction. The military theory explains fear, but not the footprints, the fire, or the shelter. The Dyatlov Pass became a magnet for myth, UFOs, unknown creatures, ancient curses, secret weapons. They persist because they are dramatic, but none of these explanations or suggestions explain why the group stayed together, why they built a fire, why some tried to return to the tent, and why others built a shelter. They were human responses, not supernatural ones. Mystery thrives where silence exists. Another explanation centers on the mountain itself. Gohlatsikhal's geography may produce katabatic winds, violent, sudden downslope gusts capable of creating intense infrasound. Infrasound can induce panic, nausea, disorientation, an overwhelming sense of dread. The theory suggests the hikers experienced a physiological terror response, a primal urge to flee. But again, the evidence resists neat packaging. Infrared sound does not explain physical injuries, it does not explain missing soft tissue, and it does not explain radiation. It still doesn't explain why trained hikers would abandon survival equipment without attempting to retrieve it once the panic had subsided. Fear may have driven them out, it did not finish the story. The uncomfortable possibility. This is where the ground becomes unstable, politically, historically, and ethically. In 1959, the Soviet Union was actively testing weapons in the Ural region. Parachute mines, experimental explosives, rocket stages. Some witnesses later reported seeing glowing orbs in the sky around the time of the incident. The injuries to the final four, blunt force trauma without external wounds, are consistent with blast pressure, not impact. A shock wave. A force that crushes internally while leaving the skin largely intact. The radiation traces, while not extreme, add weight to this possibility. And then there's the investigation itself. Files sealed, information restricted, families warned not to speak, cause of death deliberately vague. A compelling natural force is not a medical conclusion. It is a political one. But, and this does matter, there is no definitive proof. No documentation has surfaced confirming a weapons test. No physical remnants were recovered. The theory fits some facts disturbingly well, but cannot account for everything. The official conclusion. In May 1959, the investigation was closed. The cause of death was recorded as a compelling natural force. That was it. No explanation, no clarification, no follow-up. The files were sealed, families were silenced, questions were discouraged, and the Dyatlov Pass incident was quietly buried. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of the Dyatlov case is not what investigators found, but what they avoided. No full reconstruction, no reenactments, no follow-up interviews. Medical examiners recorded injuries, but did not explain the mechanisms. Prosecutors closed the case without determining responsibility. This was not incompetence, it was containment. In the Soviet system, unexplained deaths, especially involving students, potential military exposure or state failure, were liabilities, and liabilities were neutralized. For decades, avalanches were dismissed. There was no obvious debris. The slope was moderate. Searchers didn't see classic signs. But avalanche science changed. In 2019 to 2020, researchers modelled the slope using historical weather data, wind loading, snowpack behaviour, and tent placement. They showed that a small slab avalanche, delayed, compact and dense, was not only possible, but plausible. Not a roaring wall of snow, a pressure event, enough to collapse part of the tent, injure sleepers, and convince them the slope was unstable, enough to trigger flight. The slab avalanche model explains the cut in the tent, the calm retreat, the direction of travel, the forest disease, the fire, the shelter attempt, the internal injuries, the lack of external trauma, and the absence of other footprints. It does not require panic. It does not require madness. It requires cold and snow and time. But even modern investigators quickly acknowledge no theory explains everything. This is the hardest part to accept. No villain, no final revelation, just a chain of decisions that made sense until they didn't. Camping high to preserve distance, cutting into the slope, underestimating wind loading, trusting experience. The mountain didn't punish arrogance. It exploited probability. Why we struggle with this story? We want meaning. We want intention. We want someone to blame. But the Dyatlov Pass resists narrative comfort because the hikers did nothing reckless. They didn't do anything immoral and they weren't being foolish. They were capable, prepared, clever, and still they died. The truth is more unsettling than any monster. Before this became an incident, it was a group of people. Igor Dyatlov, Zinaida Komalagorova, Yuri Doroshenko, Yuri Krivonshenko, Rustem Slobodin, Ludmila Dubiena, Semyon Teletorov, Alexander Kolevatov, and Nikolai Sibiu-Brignol. They were not symbols. They were students, friends, hikers, young, alive. They deserved to be remembered for who they were, not how they died. Kholat Syakhl still stands. The snow still falls. The wind still howls. The pass still waits. No monument marks where the tent once stood. No plaque explains what happened there. Only names, only memory, and the knowledge that sometimes, even with evidence in hand, history refuses to give us the ending we want. The Dyatlov Pass incident is not a puzzle to be solved. It is a warning about nature, about secrecy, about how easily truth can disappear into snow, and about the thin line between confidence and catastrophe. This has been the Eclectic. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and remember, some answers are lost not because they were never found, but because they were never allowed to be spoken.